know what really makes us mad? Is wasting money on CDs with only one or two good songs.
Yeah. Tell them about punk.
What's up, posers? Welcome to Punk Lotto Pod. I'm your co-host, Justin Hensley.
I'm your other co-host, Dylan Hensley.
And this is the show where we choose 1 year at random and select one punk, hardcore, emo, or punk-adjacent album from that year to discuss. Today, we are joined by James Joyce of the band the Hal Al Shedad, who are an Atlanta emocore, post-hardcore band from the mid-90s. They have recently reissued their self-titled record on Noise Reel Records, run by friends of the show, Justin Martin of If It Kills You. And this conversation is a lot of fun. We cover a lot of different topics. One of my favorite parts is just talking about the Southern and Atlanta scene during the mid-90s. Really fun insights from James. And then an excellent conversation about this record that I honestly feel like we left a little on the table to talk about. But what record are we talking about today, Dylan?
We are talking about Duty Now for the Future, the 1979 sophomore record by Devo.
Yeah, it's funny. I think before we'd even recorded this episode, you had mentioned how it wasn't your favorite album by them, or one that you skipped. And we don't really get too much into that on the show. But yeah, like I said, I feel like we could have gone another hour, talking about things.
Yeah, I think we could. I mean, honestly, I think we could have broken this record down even more. But it was a good conversation. I think we I talked about a lot of relevant things, even if they aren't directly tied to the record, because it's funny. We have conversations about, ephemera and oddities in your record collection, or, people writing their names on album covers, or keeping things for posterity. We talk about celebrities and recognizing famous people in public, and I feel like all of those things are very Devo-coded things. If you've ever seen any recent interview footage of people touring Mark Mothersbaugh's studio, and just all of the wild shit that he just has from 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that he's just got drawers full of stuff. I feel like that's the mentality of a Devo fan, just keeping everything. And having scattered, strange connections to a lot of different topics. Yeah,
it's a really great conversation. I had a lot of fun talking with James. And you can head on over to our Patreon for $1. You get access to all of our weekly bonus audio. And last week we did a chart dive on the year 1979 because, oddly, we've never done that year. So surprised that we haven't done that. But we're talking about the albums that were also released that year. Not just punk music, but just kind of overall in general. Or you could join at the $10 tier, make a one-time $10 donation, and you get to choose the album we devote an entire episode to. We're going to be doing one of those next week, so that's going to be really fun. And so if you want to get your album pick in there, just go in, say, sign up one time, $10, and drop back down to $1 or $0. You don't have to stay, but we'll put it on the main feed for you, and we'll talk about it. And we're on all the social medias, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Threads, everything at Punk Lotto Pod. punklotopod@gmail.com, and our voicemail line 202-688-PUNK. And I think that is all of our plugs up top. So enjoy this conversation with James Joyce of the Hal Al Shedad. first off, how am I pronouncing the name of this band? Hal Al Shedad?
Yeah, the Hal Al Shedad.
Okay, it is essentially how it's written. Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah. We came from a time period when you had those really annoying band names that you had to explain to people all the time, or like it would always be wrong on the flyer, or you'd have like you go to you play like a venue or something. You'd be like, yeah, we're here. What band are you in? Oh, I'm in the Hal Shedad. What? What are you in? Like, we're called the Hal Shedad. Oh, okay. And it's it's from that time period. I mean, we were around from 1995 to 1999. And in that time period, in that kind of DIY post-hardcore time, like bands just had really annoyingly complex or just strange names. I feel like there's a lot of bands around that. I mean, I'm sure it's still the same way, but from my perspective, it was a weird time for bands. Like, and I think we were one of the easier ones. When I think of bands like, Konstantin Sinkati and God, what are some of the other ones? I mean, even Clickotat Katawi.
Yeah.
It's like if you don't. I remember first seeing the Clickotat Katawi album, the one on Gravity that's got the painting, the green, whatever, illustrated by. I remember seeing it as, like literally because we had a house in Atlanta called the Driver Dome, and we did shows there, and we had a guy, Gavin Frederick, who does stick figure records, and he had a distro. And I vividly remember like pulling out that record and thinking it looks so cool, but then like, what the hell is this band name? Like Clickotat Katawi, and couldn't even pronounce it. And then over time, it just becomes like kind of a household name. So it just kind of rolls off the tongue. But those were the days, I guess.
It was funny. I was doing some research on. We did a Rocket from the Crypt episode a few weeks ago, and I was doing some research and watched them. They were on like 120 minutes with Matt Pinfield, and in that they were asking like he was asking them like, what are some San Diego bands people should check out? And I think it was Adam Willard was like, oh, there's this band called Clickotat Katawi, and I was like, whoa, I never expected that name said on MTV of all places.
I'm sure all those guys like Mario and them were like, awesome. Like our name was spoken on 120 minutes. That's so amazing. I love that you did Rock from the Crypt. I'm always so bummed that they're like some of those albums are so hard to get, on vinyl or get reissued and all that. But man, talk about an amazing band. I know that's not this episode, but I really appreciate it, and also all the San Diego bands and everything. They were very influential to us as bands from across on the other side of the country, and a lot of them never really made it to the East Coast. Only a handful we really got to see ourselves. But yeah, we're more on the. I mean, coming from Atlanta, Georgia. We had a lot of connections to the Florida, like we played a lot with like Palatka, if you remember them, a lot of the No Idea bands, Columbia, South Carolina, like Ass Factor 4, Inhumanity, and then going up the East Coast. And we became really good friends with, or like going to Philadelphia a lot, we became really good friends with Franklin. Band Franklin was a huge inspiration to us. And I still think Franklin is one of the best bands of that kind of era. I think of kind of 90s DIY bands, and obviously Rainer Maria were big, buddies of ours. We did a split 7-inch with them. We toured a lot with them, and they were, they were our friends. They are our friends, but they were our friends back then. Cause I think you always need like a buddy band, when you're at least if you go on tour together, you can play to each other if nobody's there. So that was always nice to have. And Rainer Maria and Franklin especially were just such, they just had such a good time. It was always nice to do a tour with them or to play various strings of shows with them over the years. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about what the Atlanta scene was like back then, because I think nowadays when people think about like emo, emocore, anything like that, they tend to think of like Midwestern emo and its whole thing, or even specifically like the DC, Maryland area, the Mid-Atlantic region.
Yeah.
I think like Southern emo and like post-hardcore and stuff like that from that era is super underrated and overlooked. And I was just wondering, like, what was it like in Atlanta specifically? I know you mentioned some Florida bands and some South Carolina bands, but
Yeah, Atlanta had an interesting scene. So, the really sort of early on, Neon Christ was the big Atlanta like hardcore band. Sort of Neon Christ and DDT in the early 80s to like 85 or so were like sort of the quintessential hardcore bands. And then in the late 80s, there was a band called Afterwards, and they had an album on Sandwich Records, which was Amanda Mackay's label. That had Soul Side, Swizz, Shudder to Think, and Afterwards, they're like, Sandwich number 6. So the guys in Afterwards sort of built this kind of Atlanta ecosystem of shows. They sort of built up I guess what you consider the emo, sort of scene of Atlanta. From the late 80s. They were the ones that brought Fugazi first to Atlanta. So the first couple Fugazi shows were booked by the guys in Afterwards. Ignition, Soulside, I mean, just amazing shows that they had. They broke up around the end of 1989. And then there were a few bands sort of bridging the gap. There was a band called Fiddlehead from Atlanta. So not the Fiddlehead that's around now, but there was an older band called Fiddlehead. Amazing, amazing band. And then I was in a band called Car vs. Driver, which we started in 93. And, we did a split with Spirit Assembly. We sort of like carried the torch of like what Afterwards kind of started and sort of continued things along that trajectory. And so we became the de facto band to play with, every kind of regional emo band or a band sort of the same kind of scene that would come through, and kind of built a kind of a big kind of following or fan base or network of people. But then all these other bands also started coming in, like the band Inkwell is kind of known a bit. I mean, they're maybe not so much of a household name, but they were an amazing band of Atlanta at that time. And Hal Al Shedad did a split 7-inch with Inkwell. And Phil Dwyer, the singer of Inkwell, was the one who did all the design work for all of the Hal Shedad releases. So all of the artwork is from Phil from Inkwell. They were our best friends until they broke up. That's always, they were our original buddy band was Hal Shedad and Inkwell. Portrait is another kind of thought of as an emo band from Atlanta. I know that there's a lot of, they have a big cult sort of following. I don't know, over the years, I know Portrait records go for a lot of money, that kind of thing. And there was a band called Freemasonry that we loved. I mean, they were, oh my God. I kind of look at them when you think about like Rocket from the Crypt. They were like our version of a kind of a blend between Rocket from the Crypt and Jawbox. So they're almost like a DC version of a Rocket from the Crypt, just incredible driving, a little bit of a San Diego Drive Like Jehu kind of vibe to them too. But they were unbelievable. Their records are amazing. So yeah, we had this really nice network of Atlanta bands, and we had, from the late 80s through the early 90s, we had all ages venues that we could have shows at. So like, we play with Hoover, or we play with Rain Like the Sound of Trains, or we play with, everyone. We played with Drive Like Jehu when they came through.
Wow.
Unwound, you talk about Unwound. All those types of bands. We played with Lungfish and Brainiac and whoever. But then things shifted around the time that Hal Shedad started, and we started doing house shows. So we moved into our own house. We called it the Driver Dome. It was like the Car vs. Driver house. And we did shows there, all the way for the next 4 years or so. Almost, we were one of the network of houses that did shows in Atlanta, and it was a really special time. But that was fun. Everything sort of became very small scale. Instead of playing at a club and there would be like 150 people there, well, now you're playing at a house that was like only 25, maybe 30 people in a basement, but like a very devoted, people just super into it, and a very kind of special time, I think.
Was that an active choice, or was that more of just like clubs stopped booking those type of bands? Yeah,
it's kind of funny when you think about it in the, from this perspective, like 30 plus years later, is that the clubs, it just we didn't identify with it anymore. Like the clubs were all ages, but they sold beer, and it was it was a club kind of environment. There was an event that happened in Atlanta where a kid got, and this, there was a club called the Cotton Club in Atlanta where a kid from Georgia Tech who was underage got drunk. He passed out in Piedmont Park and drowned. He died.
Oh, wow.
And it was this big like sort of at that point, almost overnight, a lot of clubs became 21 and over.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the same time, I'm not saying that they were exactly correlated, but there was just kind of this like things were changing. And also the all ages clubs, I felt like were shifting towards, they would have like other shows that we didn't really identify with. And we just sort of wanted to create our own. We wanted to play like non-traditional places. So we would play like I said, house shows. There was a network of houses that were doing shows there. It became super DIY. Like we didn't want to be like affiliated with a business of like running a club, like making sure you get enough people in the door so they can pay their sound man, so they can pay their, their doorman, they can make their money for the night. It's like we just didn't feel like being part of that machine. So we wanted to do things, in different places, and that obviously it's like the same thing that was happening all over the country and all over the world. But like, doing house shows, or we would play Under the Couch, which was part of Georgia Tech. It was like a sort of a, I think it really wasn't for outside bands. It was really supposed to be for just Georgia Tech students, but it was like almost like a rec area for Georgia Tech that had a stage and had a PA, and we had Juna 44 play there. We had, we'd have like touring bands play at Under the Couch, and it was, it could hold like 150 people, and it was all ages, and we never had any problems. There was no alcohol, like it was cheap. So it was really cool. So I think there was just kind of this idea of moving away from that sort of machine, that kind of club machine where you're essentially the entertainment. You're bringing in the band, you're bringing in people to spend money on beer or whatever else. And it always just kind of like turned us off. And it's kind of funny because nowadays it's kind of like that again. I mean, I know that it would be nice if there was more. I feel like there always needs to be some sort of an all ages DIY type environment, some kind of infrastructure in a town, because kids need to like start playing shows when they're like 15, like you can't, if all your clubs or all your places to play live are 21 and over, it's like kids aren't going to play in bands, or they're going to need to have something, some place to play and to play for their friends. And I think a lot of, people are resourceful. They'll set up their own networks. And I think that's kind of what we did. And I encourage that. I always want, even in Atlanta, it's like I'm always kind of looking out, trying to see where there's like an all ages type, situation. We're planning on maybe doing a Carver's Driver show this summer, and we're looking for, it's like, we do want to do the club show, because there's a club called the Earl in Atlanta that's been around now for 25 years. So it's kind of related to that, but we kind of want to have an all ages element, because we just come from this very kind of fiercely DIY, all ages kind of inclusive background in a way. So
yeah, it's tough because I haven't really thought about it. When we were in a band in our town, it was non-traditional venues that we played at, because it was the only places to play, because our town's pretty small, so it's not like there was like a real big music venue. And if there was a music venue, it was for like bands that had a guarantee and that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
right.
There were definitely places we couldn't get in, but even still, like more like there was like a bar that we could have booked shows at very easily, but it was definitely like, that's not our scene.
Yeah.
Like, we don't want to hang out at that bar.
Right. It's not like you don't identify with these people, and it's almost like just a different group. And there could be a whole group of bands, like there are bands that were, maybe 4 years older than us that come from that scene, more of like the bar scene of Atlanta. and there's like cross pollination, but it was a little bit of like worlds collide. Like when one of those bands would play our house, there was just this culture shock. Sometimes it'd be like, what the hell? Like nobody's drinking. Like where's the keg? There's no keg. You're spending, the show starts early because we had to make sure the shows were done by like 10 p.m. You got some weirdo selling records in the front room of bands I've never heard of. Like this is just it just kind of blew people's minds, that we sort of had this culture and this whole, network set up, and it's sort of like the same, just playing the equivalent type of place in every town, had some version of this, going on. And I'm sure, still does. I'm 48 years old. So it's funny because like nowadays they'll have shows like house shows. And I'm like, I feel really weird as like a 48-year-old. Like, I don't feel comfortable going into some like 23-year-old's house to see a band play. I don't know why. It just, I've got weird hangups about it, but I appreciate, people doing it and creating things on your own. I think that's important.
You mentioned Car vs. Driver, and the first time I ever saw one of your records was in a record store in Charlotte called Lunchbox Records. Then I looked into it, and I was like, oh,
what label is it?
It started as a record label first before turning into a store, and the guy who runs it, Scott, like he helped put that record out for you. So I was like, well, my mind's blown right now. That it's just like these worlds colliding for me.
Yeah, Lunchbox Records. Actually, they put out the first. No, not the first. They put out Lunchbox Records. The second Hal Al Shedad single was the Lunchbox Records split with Inkwell. And actually, Lunchbox has a weird history in Atlanta. It doesn't actually start with the Wishart brothers. It goes back to other people. I don't even understand it. But when I was in high school, there was a tape that came out called The View. And The View, I bought in Tower Records at Lenox Mall in Atlanta because I was too young to go to record stores, true record stores at that point. And it has all these bands. Like this first time I heard Neon Christ. First time I heard Afterwards. It's the first time I heard Such As and other bands that were from that time. Fiddlehead. They were all on this comp. Really important kind of seminal Atlanta comp of the like later 86 to about 89. But Scott Wishart, who runs Lunchbox Records in Charlotte, his brother Steve Wishart was the bass player of Car vs. Driver. And Scott was in a band called Scout, which was also a really big, important band, I think, of that time. Also our buddy band, from those days. But Steve kind of ran the label for a certain time period. And then, Scott was, in the Carolinas working at Manifest Records and other places, and then eventually opened his record store and called Lunchbox Records. So it's nice to see that the name still carries on, even though, it's gone through so many hands, and that Scott still puts out records under Lunchbox Records as a label. Every once in a while there will be another release. So the Lunchbox discography is pretty cool. I think the split between Freemasonry and Scout, it's a split 12-inch, which is amazing. The Car vs. Driver albums, the singles, the Hal Al Shedad, the Inkwell stuff. There's just a lot under that label, at least from that Atlanta time period that I really love all that stuff. So
yeah, it's just funny. It's a small world. I guess that's the small world of like Southern punk and hardcore and emo and all that kind of stuff, because it's a little bit more scattered down here. Like I'm in North Carolina, and so like in the 2000s, I think things got a little bigger for this type of scene, for that kind of stuff. But it always felt like later stuff was more 2000 or more like Northern, Midwest, LA. The South just seems like an odd mishmash of different kinds of things.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because there weren't any bands like until the 2000s. You have a totally different generation of bands that came out. I would say Deer Hunter is the closest one that kind of we know of, or that we were connected to, because Josh Favre, who was the bass player of Deer Hunter, came from our kind of circle of bands. He was in a band called Electro Sleep International, with Mike Keenan from Wheeljack, who also used to play with Carter Stryver. Like there's this kind of like trajectory that you get to that ties to a band like Deer Hunter that is a household name from Atlanta. The guys in the Black Lips were younger than us and came from a completely different scene. Like they kind of had their own kind of house show scene after we had all grown up or like gone out of, left our houses and got out of college or started our adult lives or whatever. The Black Lips started doing, their own shows, in a completely different kind of scene. But then remnants of our kind of scene kind of became part of that, like Greg King, who was in Quadliacha, who was another band from Atlanta during the 90s time period that I was in mostly. And Greg King, started the Carbonas, and now in Gigi King, who are, affiliated with that sort of later, I'd say, house show scene, a little different vibe. And, the guys in Mastodon used to play in bands that we would play with, that they came more from the West End warehouse scene, which is a totally different part of Atlanta's kind of musical, heritage that I actually have a lot of connection with in the modern era. I play in a band right now called Blood Circuits that has two of the guys who used to live in that West End warehouse scene, as well as Sarge, who was the guitar player singer from Freemasonry, which is my favorite band from the 90s. When they wanted to, during the pandemic, when they wanted to start playing again, they were like, do you want to play? And I was like, well, if I'm going to play with, the guitar player singer of my favorite band from that time period, like, hell yeah, I'm going to play. So it's been fun playing, in Blood Circuits with those guys. But yeah, I'd say like, the bands from Atlanta that you would know later on, Deer Hunter, Black Lips, Mastodon, the Coat Hangers, like they kind of have like distant ties to like the 90s scene, but like the people from the 90s in those bands, they're other than doing some touring, like, Hal Shedad, we did for 4 years. We played like maybe I think 170 shows or so, did a lot of little tours, a full US tour, a full Europe tour, but otherwise sort of, kind of did what we did and that was it. It wasn't like would have been, a known band that carried on for years and years and years. Although I'm very appreciative that the guys in Noise Reel wanted to do this reissue, because that was pretty cool, because that album, the first Hal Shedad album, and really all of Hal Shedad's stuff has been out of print since probably about 1998 or so. So it's like, it's not like you can find our old albums like on Discogs and things, but it's just nice to have it reissued, and it's all new, it sounds amazing. I think they did a really great job with it. So I'm very appreciative that they were into doing it.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, because Noise Reel is run by Justin Martin, who was in the band If It Kills You, who we actually had on the show, 2 years ago now at this point. Great band too, from Bakersfield. And he's the one who actually reached out to me about having you on the show. So I was like, oh yeah, definitely, totally open to having, people on the show, especially now since we're trying to bring that back into our rotation.
Yeah.
And I guess one of my big questions was like, so how did the reissue come about?
Justin reached out. I did. How did it all come back? I think honestly, I saw a post from like 3 years ago. I helped my dad move out of his house that he'd been living in forever, and we're all getting older, so I'm helping him move out into different living situation. And we came across all the merch, like all the unsold merch from the Hal Shedad days. Like when we finished, we played our last show. I think the bin of all of our unsold records and T-shirts and 7 inches and everything just got put into the basement, like on a shelf. And so I came across it and it was like, oh, I found 30 copies of of each of the Hal Shedad albums and like a lot of extra copies of the singles and all that. And I put it out there on social media like, hey, I've got extra copies. Who wants to buy one? And so I ended up selling all those. And I think that was sort of an initial kind of thought of kind of like, well, maybe some other people might want to buy this. And I think, Justin got in touch and, I can't remember exactly how it came to be, but it was kind of like, do you want to do a reissue of the first Hal Shedad album? And I was like, yeah, that'd be super. That'd be great. I don't have I have no expectations about, if they want to do it, then I'm totally fine with it. But I wasn't, it wasn't anything I was like seeking out, but I'm really glad he did, because it was a really an amazing experience to, go through revisiting, the recordings and the artwork, and they redid everything sort of exactly to how it was originally presented, which I always loved the way they did the artwork on this album. It's all, they all these video stills from shows that they took. It's kind of Phil put it together as like a surveillance dossier was the album, and it was funny how they recreated it exactly, and they have our ID cards that I always laugh about. I lost my ID card immediately after I wish I still had it, but we made them, at the Kinko's in town, and they were using the artwork, but also the insert was really cool because it was a manila envelope or a manila file folder with like, a sticker and the lyric sheet and a picture of us, and the staple, it was all stapled together, and the staple always made like an indentation in the art, or in the, in the LP sleeve. There's like a mark of where the staple is. So I just laugh when I see that, they completely redid the original pressing of it, along with the staple that's also left the mark on my new version of it. It's like perfect.
Unfortunately, you can't really see the staple in the like images online, but that's so cool.
I know when Gavin Frederick, the guy who was the distro guy back in the 90s, at our shows, still does it. Like he's been able to live off of punk rock his entire life. It's amazing. But he sells on his Discogs page his stick figure distribution, stick figure recordings. He sells he sold my unsold copies of
Gotcha.
extra copies I have. But it's funny because he has to be, even though it's an unplayed copy, he still has to mark it as like the media or whatever. The sleeve is like, it's not near mint. It's like VG plus or whatever. I don't know. I always forget the grading, but it's not like, even though it's an unplayed copy, brand new, because of the staple mark, he has to mark it. Like he has to downgrade the quality of the record because of the staple that leaves the mark on the sleeve. I'm like, that's just perfect. So.
I guess you have to point out like shelfware if it's like been sitting in like a crate for a long time and it's got a little bit of dings on the corner. You have to point that stuff out because people on Discogs or eBay will be like, what this is not a near mint, freaking out over it.
I can't even imagine. I mean, just the I don't know how people sell, if you're like a professional, if you do like that kind of life where you're selling records off of Discogs and stuff, I feel for just how much of a nightmare the customers must be, just I don't know, just always complaining about everything and being like, this was not near mint. This has whatever, blah, blah, blah mark on it and this and that. It's just like, oh God.
I think I've complained about like a used record I bought like maybe one time. It was like an eBay buy, and it was just like unlistenable. It was so worn, and the guy like visually graded it. He was
near mint.
Well, it wasn't a case. It was definitely like I was expecting a level of wear to it. He definitely didn't go like as far as to be like, oh, this is practically unplayed or anything. Like he was like, there's some wear, but it like the way it was definitely just I almost felt bad because I knew there was going to be somewhere, but it was truly unplayable. I was just like, look, this is like, I would have paid this much for like a couple of crackles and pops. Like I don't even mind like, there's maybe one bad scratch that you just kind of have to bump the turntable. It was like from beginning to end, just
This thing's busted. This
It's like,
record is busted.
this is worthless to anyone. Like, I can't resell it.
Yeah.
It's like,
You
I
may as
know
well put it in the
you
back of your
probably
car
have,
and let
you
it
know, you
melt.
have money in it. So like, obviously I don't expect a full refund, but
Yeah. I mean, I'm personally, and I'm a big kind of always been kind of big record collector guy, but I'm not as picky about the sleeve condition. Like I don't mind having like some wear. I don't, I know that, this record is as old as I am or whatever, it's like you have a 30-year-old record. You're not expecting the sleeve to be in terrible condition, but I do like, if I have a record, it has to be like playable. Like I have to be able to like, I can take some surface noise and stuff, but I'm not gonna be, if it's like crackly the whole way through, it's gonna drive me insane. I'm not going to listen to it. It's just not going to be played. And that's also what gets me out of like, there's certain genres of music where like, for example, jazz records or reggae records and stuff like that, I'm not even really going to bother trying to seek out a lot of the originals of a lot of these records. Because for one thing, they're so expensive. But another thing is they get, there's just too much surface noise that it will drive you insane. I'd rather just get like a cheaper reissue of whatever John Coltrane record or something, whatever it is.
It was actually a Coltrane record that was unlistenable. It was probably a 60s pressing too. It was definitely not like first pressing or anything like that, but it's just like there's anything dynamic like that, anything
quiet.
The surface noise is going to overpower the music. You're just like, I can't listen to this. I don't mind some sleeve wear. There's even some kinds of like sleeve wear that I like. Like I love when people would like write their names on their records.
Oh yeah, I like ring wear where you can see where the LP is in the sleeve.
Totally.
I have a copy of Johnny Cash at Folsom Prison that my wife bought me. She like bought it off of eBay when we were dating in college, and like she didn't see it. She like ordered it on eBay and had it sent to my parents' house.
Mm-hmm.
And like I got the record, and someone had like with a pen, like just like a ballpoint pen, had drawn sideburns onto Johnny's face on the album cover.
Just like.
And I'm just like, and she was like kind of upset about it. She's like, I wouldn't have, if I had known it was on there, I wouldn't have given it to you. I was like, well, you can, ask them for some money back, because they didn't disclose that if it wasn't clear in the picture. Like, you should get a refund. But like, I don't mind that it's drawn on the cover. Like, it's funny to me now. Like, that's part of the record to me, is that somebody drew sideburns on Johnny Cash. That's my copy of it. It sounds great. Like, it plays great. So like, I really can't complain.
Yeah, especially like Folsom Prison Blues, or Live at Folsom Prison. I mean, that's so a loud live record. Like my copy of MC5's Kick Out the Jams and my copy of MC5's Back in the USA. Like I got them, I got my Back in the USA for $1, and it's like, it's a loud record, like if it's a loud, like awesome record, you're not going to notice any like surface noise. It's going to be like, it's going to play awesomely. It's like, I'm cool with that. So, and I love writing. Like I have an old copy of Stooges Funhouse that is like been like drawn all over and markered and all this crazy stuff. So I have like a nice version of Funhouse that I bought, like more modern era version of Funhouse. But then I have this super, some kid had it in his bedroom, for years, and just like it just has so much character. I love it,
I definitely have some records where people like they printed out their name and address on a little stickers and put them on the sleeves, or you can put them on the label in the record. I definitely have a few records that like I found at like Goodwill or something, where like I bought a handful of records at one time that all had the same person's name on them. Like, it was just, they donated all their records.
I love finding like poetry in records, like anything that's left. Sometimes you'll just find like weird things. Nowadays, like as my kids have been growing old, like when they were growing up, like all of their drawings that they made, like all their art and stuff, I've put them in the records. So there's like you'll pick out a record you haven't listened to for 5 or 10 years or something, and there will be like one of your kids' drawings in there, which I think is really cool. I'll like put the date on it, so it's like its own insert.
That actually reminded me. I have a copy of I have like a box set of the Lord of the Rings books that I found from the 70s, but like I have the copy of Fellowship right here, where someone like there's like a check stub that they wrote their like daily schedule on. It's like dishes 20 minutes, cabinets 20 minutes, living room 15 minutes, for like how much time they're going to spend on cleaning their apartment. And then there's like, I think there's like a recipe in here too on like some just a sheet of paper. It's like, well, that's going to be in that book for the rest of my life at least.
Yeah, it's just like a little bonus thing. One time, Hal Shedad did a zine that was a cookbook zine, that we were one of the bands. I think I'd have to figure out if I still have it, but it was all these different bands submitted their recipes. So like, Captain Jazz and like their recipe for whatever. I can't remember what recipe, like Ben Lukens, our bass player singer, he was probably the one who, was the most like sort of, I'm vegan, I'm cooking all this stuff. I think he submitted like a vegan recipe of some kind for the Hal Shedad page of it. But I thought that was really funny to have like a vegan cookbook zine that every page was a different band's recipe.
Which totally makes sense too, because there are so many like vegetarians and vegans in like punk and hardcore like that. So yeah. It's actually really like, oh man, that'd be really cool. I'd like to see what recipes are in there. That sounds great.
Yeah, totally. I'll see if I can find it, because I think like it's one of those things when, Ben or Ed or me were like moving, and then we come across like a bin of just stuff. And I think Ben found a bunch just recently and sent me all these pictures of things I'd never seen before, like pictures from the record that were never used, like all these little surveillance photos. He has all the original prints of all of them, and a lot that were never used. So I want to see them again, because they're like, I have no memory of some of the stuff that we were doing. But I think he found the recipe book as well, which should be cool to see.
Yeah, that'd be an interesting thing because we have a buddy, Hugo Reyes. He's a writer, and he has recently been like buying zines off of eBay, like old zines, and then like scanning them and uploading them online just to look at them. Like he's in Chicago, so there are a lot of Chicago centric zines that he's been pulling, and there's just some awesome, really cool, interesting stuff in there. Because like zines are like, they're so like of the moment, and like once they're out there, and like nobody's keeping those in print, really, unless that's your full-time job is like a print, zine maker, which whose job is that? That's pretty rare.
Yeah, they're like anarchist zines where it's like, this is the same information that we always use, so we just keep the one in print.
Yeah.
I have
like crime thinking.
Gavin, when you'd buy stuff from Stick Figure, Gavin would always put zines and things into the record. So I have a lot of my old like 90s records still have zines inside that either I bought at the distro at that time at the show and put into the record and kept, and they're really funny. They're just such great, like almost like folk art, of the time. There's this guy, Randy Goo, who is one of, he was like a hardcore kid back in the 80s in Atlanta, within the kind of circle of people within the Neon Christ scene. So he's older than me, but he became a library. He's like the head of like this library at Emory University, and he created a punk archive at Emory, and he has a zine archive. So he's taken all zines from all eras, and it's just this massive archive. He takes all original flyers and all like artifacts, records mainly from Atlanta. But it's really cool, like as far as, I like that he thinks in that way, like as an archivist, and he's like, no, this is culturally significant stuff that I'm going to preserve, as far as the history of Atlanta, or the history of like this era of music and kind of DIY culture from that time. It's really cool.
And that stuff can get lost so easily. And like once that little ephemeral tiny piece of merch or zine is gone, like it's gone for good. Like it then it just becomes like people who remembered it maybe be like, yeah, there was a zine that was pretty cool, but like people's memories are faulty, and it's not the exact same thing of being like being able to flip through it yourself. So yeah, I'm
So
a
it's
big
kind of
fan
like
of that.
30 copies or whatever that they made,
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to save that stuff when I get it. Like I have definitely have a lot of stuff that just got jammed in the the mailers from like Count Your Lucky Stars and Square of Opposition, all of those labels that I was buying stuff from a lot. I just have a bag full of the little things that got stuck in there, like stickers, here's other records that we're putting out. Those things I just keep them because I'm like, this is gonna be gone if I don't keep it. Like,
yeah,
who knows who else has it?
I have all this old anti-Olympic stuff from when the Olympics was in Atlanta from 1996. So that was a big thing. There was a lot of anti-Olympic kind of zines and flyers and things like that. And we had a mascot called Spoil Sport. So it's like Spoil Sport is against the Atlanta Olympics, and this is gonna do there's just a lot of crappy things. It's sort of like when the Olympics comes to your town, it sort of changes the town, sort of permanently. And there's a lot about Atlanta. I think that changed from 1996 onwards. Is like Atlanta's a different town than it was before, I would say 1996. But then again, like every city has this kind of somewhat unrecognizable, in a sense. We sort of live in the future nowadays, so it's kind of strange.
Yeah,
but it makes
LA
you
is
think
going through
about
that
those things that in that time period, like the things that still exist today that were from that time. I like that. That's like really, to me, that's really special. Whatever it is, you kind of have to preserve what's left, or kind of celebrate it, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour and we've yet to touch on the album. So
I know you can edit this as much as you want, of course.
No,
Feel free to bounce around.
It's a good convo. So let's get into, I guess, the rest of the show. You can get the record, the reissue of the Hal Al Shedad self-titled. You can get that from Noise Reel Records. I'll have a link to that in the show notes. And very, very fun conversation around all that. So now let's get into the meat of the show, I guess is how I'll put it. But so the premise of the show is we sign our guests a year and they choose one punk or punk adjacent album from that year for us to discuss. And I gave you the year 1979 because when I first started talking to you, I said, what range of time is you're most interested in? You said from the 60s to like the end of the 90s or like the beginning of the 2000s. Yeah. And I was like, well, most of our guests never say the 70s, so let's go to the 70s. So I gave you 79. And before we get into the record that we are going to talk about today, what are some other records from that year that you were considering for us to talk about?
My God, I was shocked because you sent me this list of like all the kind of punk and adjacent alternative, new wave, whatever, kind of interesting records from 1979. And I couldn't believe, you go through the list. We're talking about, Joy Division, Unknown Pleasures, London Calling, Clash, Fear of Music, Talking Heads, Gang of Four Entertainment. I almost thought about Gang of Four Entertainment because I really think Gang of Four, I feel like most post-punk music, from Fugazi onwards kind of owes almost everything to Gang of Four. Like I feel like they really set the template for what sort of post-punk music, especially the Entertainment album and Solid Gold. I think that's an incredibly significant album kind of musically for all the music that we love, from since then. The first Cure record, Wire 154, Metal Box Pill. Every one of these is an amazing record. I almost said B-52s. The first B-52s record was an important record just because I live in Atlanta. B-52s technically were an Athens band before they moved to New York. They really put Athens on the map musically. They were kind of the first ones to really, nobody knew what Athens, Georgia was before the B-52s in a way, especially from a music perspective. So I thought that would be nice to talk about. But I think and the other thing that I was shocked about was that both the first two fall records came out in 1979, Live at the Witch Trials and Dragnet, which blows my mind because I always thought of Live at the Witch Trials being a little earlier than 79, but maybe it was the US pressing. I don't know, but
Could be.
it could be. But I think that's just talk about like a 1-2 punch of your first two records being in the same year. I mean, it's just an amazing year for records. But the one I settled on was the second Devo record, or the second Warner Brothers Devo record, because they had records before they were signed to Warner Brothers. But Duty Now for the Future, the second Devo record, is the one I settled on for this episode specifically.
Yeah. Yeah. So you chose Duty Now for the Future by Devo.
I got my coat, I got my keys, I got my head down to my lungs and move my feet. Me, I got all the secretaries down on their knees. Look at them scoot. They're gonna
And I have a couple stats on the record, I like to call them. So Devo were from Akron, Ohio, and they formed in 1973. And this is the band's second full-length studio album. I guess you could call the earlier stuff kind of rough.
All over the place.
Demos almost. And it was released June 1st on Warner Brothers Records. And the personnel on this record is Mark Mothersbaugh on vocals, keys, and guitar, Gerald Casale on vocals, bass, and keys, Bob Mothersbaugh on guitar and vocals, Bob Casale on guitar, keys, and vocals, and Alan Myers on drums. And the record was produced by Ken Scott. So we'll get into a little bit.
You know who Ken Scott is?
So the little bit of research I did on Ken Scott was that he had previously worked with David Bowie, and he'd done Aladdin Sane and Pink Spiders from Mars. Yeah.
Yeah. He did Hunky Dory. He did the Man Who Sold the World. It always blew my mind that this was the producer of the second Devo record, because he also came from the Beatles. He was the engineer on all these Beatles records as well.
He was one of the Abbey Road engineers.
Yeah. How did they? I mean, the choices of producers has always been strange to me with Devo, because their first album was produced by Brian Eno.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
At Connie Plank's studio. And honestly, Eno said, I didn't even produce the record. Like, Devo really produced the record. Like, they were so like focused on what they wanted everything to sound like. They sort of forced themselves, like they forced it into being. And so this second record, produced by Ken Scott, it's like, well, how did they get connected to Ken Scott? And then I thought about, it was probably because of Bowie. Being the producer, being the producer of all those Bowie records, and Bowie being such a big fan of Devo, it probably said, well, why don't you use my producer, from the seminal, his run of albums. I mean, you think about from The Man Who Sold the World through Aladdin Sane, it's like, that's a run that's untouchable. And maybe, we'll see what Ken can do with them. But it's an interesting record for sure. I would say traditionally been one of I'd say nowadays New Traditionalists might be my favorite record of Devo's, but this is kind of my favorite of their sort of early-ish material, because everything on those first two records was written in Ohio before they had moved to LA, and basically was their original set of music was the first album and this album kind of combined together. And they just kind of split. I mean, they could have done a double album as their first album, but they just sort of split it in two to have two, basically these are all in a way kind of like the B-sides of what were the A-sides on the first album in a way.
It's interesting, the Ken Scott production thing, because like you mentioned with Eno, and Eno like definitely is like, oh yeah, they did all of it. Like they knew what they wanted it to be. And you listen to that record and you listen to the record that we're talking about, and you think like, what could Ken Scott have possibly have done to this.
I know.
Like, and it's more than likely he just kind of sat back and hit record, because after the second Devo record, there's really no producers. Like, there's engineers credited, but it's Devo is the producer on everything else. So it's very much a case of they're like, no, we know exactly what we want to do. We just like don't have the clout, I guess, or maybe didn't feel confident telling the engineers what to do as the artists, maybe. And that's where like a producer could be helpful.
It's probably Warner Brothers maybe kind of said, look, you need a producer.
Yeah.
And so Ken probably engineered it, but you're right. Like Devo produced themselves. They're so like just singular minded. And they're also very like wary of outsiders. They're like such this insular Midwestern group. I mean, it's such a like, I think about Akron, Ohio, and I just think about these guys just being so, they've been around since 73, now it's 79 and they're making this, their second major label album. And they're just like, I would imagine they're just so mistrustful and kind of paranoid. Almost that kind of, it's almost this like Midwestern sensibility of this sort of closed, these are very like, this is a very tight knit, close group of guys. Always just the five of them, and they never really like collaborated with very many people. Like I think Neil Young was about the closest that they ever really kind of they let them into their circle, but they're such a they're on their own little island in a way. Devo's always been, which is kind of a shame because I feel like their creativity, if they were more collaborative with people, they would have probably done some really interesting things, and not like they didn't. They did amazing art and multimedia stuff, and all their ideas were amazing. But I feel like they almost like restricted themselves a bit, when they could have been more, if they had been more open to Eno and sort of collaborating in a way with him, like it could have been more like what the Talking Heads sort of became. Like Devo could have been a little bit more that direction or something. But they were who they were. I mean, they were kind of like a fully formed, band that sort of did what they wanted to do. So
I do have a little insight on the Ken Scott and Devo relationship. So I read about this. So Ken Scott, he talked about how much fun he had working with Devo, and he thought they were extremely professional. Like Ken Scott, by all accounts, loved it. Had a great time with them. The band now, they think that he ruined the record.
Okay, like I wonder what he did. Like I said, what could have been done differently on this record?
So one of the things that they were critical about was, so they wanted to kind of like capture their like live sound in studio, like the first record kind of has that feel, and they really wanted to put that into the studio. But Ken wanted the band to do a more processed and like lean into the more robotic and electronic side of the band, because this was a big pivot record for them as far as using synths more than guitars. Right. And so he was like, we need to lean into this. We need to be like, let's do more, I guess he's probably thinking more like Gary Newman or Kraftwerk type stuff, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, Replicas came out the same year. So you're thinking like that's almost like a sister album to this. It's a Gary Newman Replicas album.
So they were mad that he made them record each instrument by itself, like tracking each instrument individually instead of live in the studio. And they were mad that they made them use a click track to those songs too, which I find incredibly hilarious, because we did an episode on REM's Life's Rich pageant, and the producer they had on that was the guy who did like the big John Mellencamp records of the 80s. And he was the guy who was like, we're using a click track on all these songs and you're going to enunciate more. So, and the band at the time was like, ugh, I don't want to. I want to be live in studio.
Yeah, I think.
And so, like, I just think it's really funny when bands like, he made us use a click track, and it's like, I don't know, it's a different way of recording music, but it has its merits too,
It's funny that that doing proper overdubs and using a click track and using more synthesizers are the things that the band hated about the record, but that's the direction that they go in on their self-produced records afterwards. They're like almost nothing but synthesizers, and like eventually Alan he leaves the band because he's like, you're just going to use a drum machine anyway.
Right.
Like, he's like, what's the point of me even being here? It's just
Yeah,
funny.
I think it is interesting because you're thinking that just from a practical perspective, if you have all this sequence stuff that you're working with and you're layering all these synths and you're doing all this other stuff, it's like you're almost like you're going to have to play to a click track, you know, eventually, and you're going to have to do. I mean, for them, I'm sure like if they had Pro Tools, you know, developed at that time, they would have just like put everything in and like just copied and pasted stuff all over the place. You know, they would have probably loved all that. They've been the pioneers of that technology. So it is interesting that you're saying that they almost wanted it to be more organic and more live sounding, and he was pushing against that. But that's the way they sort of that's the direction they totally headed in after that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very funny how I guess like he saw what they were going for, and he's like, you can't just willy nilly do this lot. You know, you need to actually like time this stuff out perfectly so that it works together.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a mess.
I think that it's I think the synthesis. I know Mark definitely pushed them more towards synthesizers. I think that's something that was already they were already moving in that direction because he was interested in it. So it's probably the other guys in the band.
I think it's Bob Mothersbaugh, his brother. I feel like Bob One has always been the rocker of the band. He was the one who always kept the guitar. Like when everybody else is going to keytars and synths, just standing at synth stations. And even now when you see them, you know, he is the one that always has had a 6-string guitar of some sort.
Yeah.
He's always played. He's the rock element that they'll never let go. I think that I think this album itself is really an interesting album, you know, as far as Devo is concerned. And I mean, I started listening to them when I was 15, I think. And it was this album, and the first 2 albums for sure were the big albums of mine. So I mean, they go back to early childhood, being into what they were doing, because these were the records that you could find, you know, sort of in your suburban record store. And there was a video store that we had that had the Men Who Make the Music or whatever you call it, their movie that they made. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it's a really amazing, you know, it's basically a collection of all their homemade, you know, all the Jago Homo era stuff from Akron, as well as the live, like a lot of live footage from around the first album. And they had that video, and they had X, the Unheard Music video cassette, and I rented them all the time, and I became a huge fan of Devo from that time onwards. And you know, has always been, from a drumming perspective, Alan Myers is like a hero of mine. I mean, the drumming he does on all the Devo records, you know, all the way through, has just been amazing. All the way through, I guess Shout was the one that he left on, or Total Devo. But yeah, Alan's amazing. And to see them now with Josh Freese, I've seen them a lot. I saw them at the big LA Fest, Cruel World.
Yeah.
I saw them at the 930 Club when they played the first album in its entirety, which is really fun. Just different times when they played Atlanta and all that. So it's nice to see. But I think Josh has done a great job drumming with it as well. So
It's interesting. So I was reading a lot about this record, and a lot of the critical reviews and the reviews from around the same time period, and even like the Pitchfork review from like not long ago, they're all very critical of this record. This record has the stigma of a sophomore slump. Like it has the negative reputation that, shockingly, like their later works are much more maligned and much more like just like negatively reviewed. So I'm amazed at like how negative the writing around this record is, because everyone talks about how they just didn't live up to the expectations of that first record, and the next record would be so much better than this one.
I think it was just their decision. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was go ahead.
I was just saying, I think it's their decision that they, because I've read a few Devo books, and Gerald Casale, I remember when they were flying to, or I think I remember it was like on a plane or something, that they were deciding, because they had, 30 songs or whatever that they had written over the years that they could use, as their first record. And they picked, the songs that were going to be on the first Devo album, Are We Not Men, We Are Devo. And then the rest of the songs were going to be on the second album. And I think maybe that was a maybe not the best choice, because several of these I remember, they've been playing them for years. I think maybe they should have sort of started, written some more new songs potentially, for the second album. I could be wrong, but there is a certain element of like, I love the first two albums the most, I would say. And the first album seems to definitely has its share of weird songs, right? But it has a lot of their sort of early well-known hits. It has, Uncontrollable Urge and Jocko Homo and their cover of Satisfaction, and it has Gut Feeling. It also has, Space Junk and other songs that are more, goofy. Come Back Johnny, I love. So that's like a solid album. It's almost like it's front loaded a little bit, because these seem to be a little bit of the scraps. But I like the scraps. Like I like Clockout. I love Wiggly World. I love, Smart Patrol, Mr. DNA. I'm a big fan of the band The Digits from Chicago, and their version of Mr. DNA is just, I love it. It made me like solidified my love of Devo, was hearing the Digits cover of Mr. DNA. And Secret Agent Man, that goes all the way back to really early Devo years, that they put on this album. And there's a lot of just weird songs, like it's an interesting album. What I think, it doesn't have all the hits that you know them for. And when you see them live now, I think the only song that I think they will play, they'll play Secret Agent Man, and they'll play Smart Patrol, Mr. DNA. Like those are the two songs from this album that they still play now regularly. But most of the others have been kind of lost to time, but I still love them as really interesting, unique songs. It's like a more interesting listen to me, for me. Like if I'm going to put on a record of theirs, I'll put on this one, honestly, before I'll put on the first album, or even, Freedom of Choice is a great album, but it's just like, it's just oversaturated, like I've heard Freedom of Choice. I love Gates of Steel. I love Whip It, whatever. But I think it's like, I don't need to hear those songs another time in my life. I've heard them, hundreds of times at this point, so you're like, just in general day-to-day life. But I feel like Duty Now for the Future has all these songs, that are really great and weird, truly weird and interesting songs that they wrote. And honestly, in a way, I kind of wish that they had continued making more weird, interesting songs. And I feel like them signing to Warner Brothers was almost a way of them. They sort of got locked into that machine of like, well, now we have to make a hit single. Now we have to make a hit video. We have to be a hit band. Whereas if they had stayed maybe on Stiff Records, from their EP before this, before the first album, or just stayed kind of in the independent circuit, it might have been interesting to see where they would have gone as a band. And they might not have lasted very long. They may have only made another album or two, but who knows?
Yeah, it's interesting because you have to, I still maintain that they kept their weirdness in the major
sure
label
did.
sphere.
You're right. Absolutely.
So for the greater good of like art and music and entertainment and everything, like it's probably best that they did sign because we have such a long history. Like we have how many years is that? Is that 50 years? Almost.
Yeah, they came up. I mean, for 73, they hit 50 years.
Yeah. So we have 50 years of weird Devo. Whereas if they'd stuck with like independent only stuff, like there's a chance they fizzle out in the 80s and like kind of become this little niche thing that like only people who are real, deep vinyl, nerds will find this kind of stuff,
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think I do truly appreciate that they have always made really weird, deeply subversive songs. And I really appreciate that's another reason why I love Devo is that, they did do things in a sort of mainstream way. They sort of broke into the mainstream. I mean, they're like a cult band and everybody knows Whip It, but I think that like they definitely introduced a lot of this like true weirdness that they are, into a lot of people's lives that otherwise would never have been exposed to their music. And I have a theory that it's their Midwestern. I go back to like Ohio. Like I feel like Ohio makes true weirdos in music. Like it's crazy. I mean, you think about the Cramps, you think about Pere Ubu, you think about, I mean, obviously like Brainiac or even other bands. I feel like Ohio, the Midwest and Ohio especially, has generated some true musical weirdos, and Devo's like a perfect example of that.
Yeah,
it's like it's in their blood.
The hostile environment, the relative like kind of isolation, being passed over culturally, the
industrial sort of like Cleveland and Akron.
Yeah, it being such a center of industry, like attracting so many people and so many people live there, but it's kind of just like its own little weird little bubble of passive aggressive people.
Yeah.
No, it's not New York City, it's not LA, it's no coastal elite kind of culture, and the people just the people that are like, well, I want to make stuff are like, what is there to talk about? Well, capitalism's evil. Potatoes are neat.
I mean, they just make those. I think just there's such interesting music, and yeah, I agree. Like, I look at East Coast, like New York and punk and all that kind of stuff. Very cerebral, and also very artistic, kind of high-minded art. Not like whatever, but I think that there's sort of a sort of an arty like elitism to New York bands in a way, and thinking about it like a Television or something like that. Yeah. And then West Coast, you have all of the great, West Coast punk and sort of a fun or a kind of this sort of California vibe going to the music, that has its own spirit. But then I feel like the Midwest just brings just like, all the Chicago bands, Minneapolis bands, Ohio bands. You just have this like string of just really deeply strange and weird bands and just real, truly like insular weirdos, coming from these areas, which I love. I mean, I love all of it. So I almost feel like, what would happen also if Devo never moved to LA, because I think they sort of got a lot of LA, transformed them, I think, from freedom of choice onwards. So, once again, it's all what if.
Got a surprise from my honey, got a message from my girl. When she picked up a pen from beside her bed and wrote me a scribbled note, said she'd be coming back to see me, said she would be visiting real soon. Gonna get up from the long
It's funny. I was thinking about the B-52s too, because you mentioned them as being one of your options, and I know they moved to New York, and that's really where a lot of their exposure came from. But in my mind, they're still very much the Athens band. Like that. That is what they are at their core, because that's where they, started and came up. And even thinking about them in the context of the South, like one, they have gay members of the band, and so they're tapping into an entire other part of subculture, basically, of America, especially in the 70s, that's completely unique to what Devo is doing too. They're doing their own thing in a more, their whole philosophy that they came up with. So, but even B-52s play very weird music that it's kind of kitschy, like it's like a throwback in some ways. But even they have that hint of being like, we're weirdos from the South, and we're putting out some challenging music in a fun, little more over the top way than Devo. Maybe, they're different kinds of over the top, because Devo's definitely over the top, but B-52s are more camp, I guess, is what you would go with that.
But I think
I'm sure.
But yeah, musically subversive too, like, because B-52s are doing, they're doing so much like 50s, 60s, throwback stuff, but Ricky Wilson's playing in like open guitar tunings, and they're I mean, and Ricky and Cindy, they came from Athens originally. Like they're born and bred. And that's also interesting when I think about that, because Athens is such a transplant type town. Like they all because of UGA and the college, and all the REM guys came from different places and came to Athens. But that was, they were, I think about probably back then, you would think B-52s and Devo were sort of like synonymous with each other to a certain extent, in that kind of thinking about both those bands sort of being around at the same time, second Devo album, first B-52s album, and both of them kind of having dancey elements, sort of guitar-y, but kind of quirky, definitely arty. But it is interesting. They probably would have been, I don't know if they ever like shared a bill together or anything. It would have been interesting to think about them being on the same show together sometimes, but or crossing paths or whatever. But it would have been I do think that they're sort of cut from a similar cloth in a way, with Devo actually being extremely like focused and having these are like art school guys, making music. They're an art project. B-52s are, like campy art, but also from like a thrift store culture, and kind of grabbing what's around you and making something, amazing out of it, and something beautiful out of, this repurposing of things around them, kind of taking elements of like surf music and like, I don't know, exotica and weird dance music and all this other stuff, and just having a party. It's kind of interesting to kind of compare and contrast those two bands, because like Devo's not about having a party. Like B-52s are having a party, and but they're both just such seminal bands that both kind of came from around the same period and had kind of there's definitely some similarities between the two. Devo records are certainly fun, but you're listening like these are very neurotic people. It's just these guys are not letting loose. I mean, or at least in a way that they are letting loose is kind of like, that's a little unnerving. Like, I'm uncomfortable often while listening to Devo, and I love Devo, but you just like, they do things and you're just like, this is the most unhinged thing a person could think of. It's like, I don't know how you arrive at these conclusions.
I think
and still make it accessible. That's the real balancing act, is what's impressive. But
it's just the art that they created. I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be sort of like in their company. It's like, who would you rather hang out with? I mean, would you hang out like, obviously the B-52s would be would be amazing. You know, you think about hanging out with them in New York or something, being part of that scene. The man Devo scene, that would be a weird, you know, they seem like they would be an interesting crew to spend time with, you know. Like
the Devo party, there's a bowl of chips on the table that you don't know if you're supposed to eat.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like they would definitely like mess with you. There's a lot of like, you know, it seems like they would really like to push buttons, you know. They definitely like to keep you on edge a little bit. I think they that's part of their entertainment is definitely in that side of things with Devo, especially. I mean, I don't know. I remember when Devo played in Atlanta and the Black Lips opened. I need to talk to some of those guys about or just get information about hanging out with them, because they were talking about how backstage with them and stuff. And I just feel like it would be such a bizarre environment to be in, you know, hanging around with those guys.
It's funny. I have not met, but I have served Mark from Devo twice. He's come into the restaurant that I work at
Oh, cool.
a couple of times. And the first time he was there, it was really shortly after I started working there. And Julia Louise Dreyfus was also there. She had like a huge party. She had like 14 people. I put cornbread in front of her. She was very nice. She was like, "Oh, that looks lovely." Like, you seem like a nice person, like a genuinely nice person. And then like I saw Mark in the restaurant later, a little bit later, and it was like, is that him? Is that Mark from Devo? And as I kept looking at him, and I kept walking through the restaurant, like running food back and forth, and it finally, like, I had looked at him enough times that he kind of like looked at me, and we made eye contact, and he gave me like the psychic message of like, don't. Please don't talk to me.
Not right now.
I just want to eat. And which was like, I'm not gonna like approach anyone at a table. It's just, I'm not that amazed whenever I see a celebrity. It's kind of just like, oh, that's neat, you know.
You didn't go up to him and be like, "Here's your plate of spuds that you ordered."
Well, the funny thing is, the second time he came in with Tony Hawk, who I did the thing where you don't recognize Tony Hawk. I completely didn't recognize him. Everyone said it was Tony Hawk later. I was like, oh shit, it was. And like Rodney Mullen and Shepard Fairey was there, and there might have been somebody else. Another like, so it was like the world of skateboarding and like art guys all like,
and Mark Mothersbaugh.
And Mark Mothersbaugh was there. And so I recognized him immediately the second time. And I brought a bowl of potatoes to the table because we have fried potatoes on the menu. And like I put them in front of Mark, and he goes, "What is that?" Like I said what it was, but he didn't hear me. He goes, "What was that?" And it was, I cannot believe I didn't just yell "Spuds." Like, I'm shocked that I managed to control myself, because it just popped into my head immediately. Because like, he's not gonna like that. Like it was, like I had that whole conversation in my head. You never know. A second, I was like, do I say it? No, I shouldn't say it. It was just potatoes.
I'm so oblivious. Like I would never. It could be all those people at a table together, and it would just never connect with me who any of them were. You know, I'm terrible at like recognizing people. The only person that I think about sometimes is in similar situation was that I had to go to Iceland for work, and I saw Bjork in Iceland in the hotel that we were staying in. And even the people I was with who aren't like music fans or whatever, they were like, "That's Bjork over there." And so we started to approach her, because you're just like, who else could it be? You know, like somebody like that. You're like, you're gonna see her, you're gonna be like, who? That's Bjork, you know. Anyway, and she instantly targeted us and was like, "No!" Like she was like, "Just no. This is personal time. Don't leave." Not now, not today, or whatever, you know. And we were like, okay.
And if anyone was going to be drawing lines like that, it would be her. You know, with the history of her fans.
I'm respecting her privacy. I'm respecting her space. She had some sort of meeting or something, and we got onto a bus because we were going to some like touristy thing. The bus driver said, if you may have noticed, one of our local celebrities, Björk, is at the hotel. And you notice that I call her by her current, her real pronunciation is Björk because it rhymes with jerk. And we were like, okay, it's Björk then. So,
Which that's kind of unnecessarily unfair to her. She may be like truly awful and like actually rude to people, but like I think it's not unfair to just draw that line to be like, no, don't do that. That's because I think of like Henry Rollins always has the reputation of being like he's really rude to people, and it's like, are you sure you weren't just like yelling "get in the van" at him from like across the street? Like, I don't think that's a rude reaction to be like, hey, leave me alone. I'm doing something right now.
I read one of Henry's books. It was like the book he wrote when the Rollins band reunited and they went on tour with X. And so it's like a tour diary book that also taps into some of his international travel stuff. But there's a part in one of the books where he says he's walking through the airport. Some guy sees him, recognizes him as Henry Rollins, and just goes, "What are you doing here?" And then Henry's response back was, "What are you doing here?" Like yelling it back at him. Like, "I'm at the airport. What do you think?"
And then they become best friends.
I don't know that Henry has very many friends that aren't Ian Mackay
and Heidi.
Anybody he knew in DC before he left.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anybody from before 1981 is it's extended as friends. Yeah. Yeah. I think I didn't hold. I definitely. I'm always super just. Anybody like that, I'm either I don't know who they are, I don't recognize them, I don't make two and two together. Even like friends of mine, if I see them in an environment that I'm not expecting to see them, it like won't register. I don't know what's wrong with my brain, but it's like it'll take me a second. It'll be a person I've seen, I see every, like for years, but always in like this one place, like where they work at this bar or something. Yeah. And then I'll see them at the grocery store and it'll just like, I don't know. There's something about my brain that just short circuits in that way. So I'm like, in the end, probably I don't recognize famous people at all. And I just let them live their lives. So
that kind of reminds me when I've told the story on the show before, I think, but we went to Fest one year and my glasses broke that year. And so I had to go to Lens Crafters. There's like a Lens Crafters nearby where we were staying, and luckily they could do it in an hour, like they say they can. And so I was able to get new glasses within a day. And me and my friend were walking through to pick them up, like after I'd already left and come back to get them. And we ran into Jim from the band The Fake Boys, who are a Boston punk band. And it was like him and his wife were walking through the mall too. And it was so surreal because we were at a music festival and you don't expect to see people that like are also at the music festival just in a regular shopping mall, like a regular standard ass mall. And it was, we were, all four of us were kind of like thrown off by just like, oh, hey, it's weird. We're here in front of like a Sparrow and a Starbucks, like, and instead of meeting each other in line at a show or at the merch table at a booth somewhere. But
right,
it's once you change the background around the person is when it makes it just like very strange interaction with them.
It's very surreal. I went to school at UGA in Athens for the first year of college, and that was in 1993. And Wuck Street Records is the main record store there. It's been there since 1976 or whatever. And so I was in there record shopping, and like Kurt Cobain and all the guys from Nirvana and Michael Stipe come in, because what happens is when big bands like that would play Atlanta, like they would all go and hang out with Michael Stipe in Athens. And so you'd see them at the restaurant, the Grit, which is a restaurant that he was used to own or be part of an owner of, or see them in Wuck Street or whatever. So, but it was just funny because it's just like 2 p.m. and they had played the night before in Atlanta, and I remembered later, like, but you're just kind of looking through records and you're like, who are these people that came in? Like, it didn't register that was like there was Kurt Cobain, there was Courtney Love. They had their baby with them. They had Dave Grohl, whatever, and Michael Stipe. So that was also the connection. It's like, oh, well, there's Michael Stipe. So then these are people. But for some reason, I didn't realize that it was Nirvana, and just sort of finished and walked out. And then like the people I was with was like, there's Nirvana over there, like in that record store. And it was just like, it didn't register for me because it wasn't like you're expecting these people to come through the door. You just see like, oh, there's some real weirdos like sort of walking in the door or whatever. So, but it was fine. They seemed to be, I left them alone as as is nice to do.
That's the nice thing. I mean, because really, in all reality, like, what are you gonna do? Be like, now I guess you have cell phones. You can be like, take a picture with me, and it's like, why?
Yeah.
Like, look, I forced them to take a picture with me. It's like, yeah, cool. They probably weren't happy about that.
I need to be able to prove that I saw them, and it's like, well, I mean, like, you can just say that you saw them. Like, I don't know that people have like a. Why are people gonna disbelieve that you saw this person that was in town?
Oh, he's always lying about seeing celebrities.
Yeah. And whenever Fugazi would come in, Michael Stipe would always bring, and all four of them would be like sort of in the same situation. Like you just see like, well, Fugazi's in town. There's everybody, there's Guy, there's Brendan, there's Ian, there's Joe, there's Michael Stipe, we're all having dinner before the show. So you're always like, ugh. But the funny thing happened, and I know this is a really kind of weird, evil thing, but just the way your mind works is that after that happened, like after we left the record store and they were in records like in Wuck Street or whatever, and I got in my car and I pulled out. And I'm driving up to the record store, and they all cross the street in front of me. And for a split second, this back of your mind thing is like, what if I ran them all over? Like, what if I was like, I could be like Lee Harvey Oswald. Like I could have just, I mean, it's obviously it's like a terrible thought, but just like the way your brain works, and you're just like, oh my God, that would have like changed music. You would have destroyed REM, Nirvana, and everything in one swoop. It would have been just unbelievable. So it's just this weird thing that popped in my mind. And
I could be the guy. I could be the guy who causes the day the music died.
I know, you would have been like the plane that killed Buddy Holly and Richie Valens. It would have been. It just is like this weird thing that flashed in my mind because I was like, they were walking across the street and I was kind of driving at them. And it could have been one of those things like in the moment, I could have just floored it and seen what happened,
What if my accelerator got stuck? Yeah.
I know.
How fast can Guy Picciotto run?
Right. How, like what? Yeah. Anyway, it's just like this, those evil things that go into your mind, in a flash. So.
Well, I guess we should probably wrap up here. We've kind of been all over the place with this record, but any like final thoughts on this record in particular?
I think people, I think it gets, I don't think people really give it the credit it deserves. I really think that it's a really interesting album. I think it gets eclipsed by the first album and the third album in that sense, so because those are two such seminal albums that everybody's going to like put down, Duty Now for the Future. But I really think it's in a way, to me, the most interesting album of songs that are just, sort of strange and kind of stick out and in different ways. And there's a few hits on it, but I do agree it's a sophomore slump. But I do think it is a better album than people think it is.
I definitely slept on this one in their discography. And I remember getting into Devo and kind of working my way through most of their records kind of in succession. And this one, when you go from the first record to this one to the third one pretty close to each other, it is really easy to overshadow the second one. Taking the second one out of the context of it and listening to it, and then listening to it as being like, well, I've listened to it, so many other Devo records so many more times, and this one like stuck in my memory as being that's the skippable one. to come back to it out of context and just like really focus on it individually, I'm like, this should not be skipped over. This is a great record. It's unique in their discography because it feels like the first record in terms of songwriting, but then sounds more like the third record in terms of production. And that's super unique in their discography. There's really no records that sound like this, other records by them that sound like this. And there's killer songs on it. I mean, there's tons of great songs. Clockout, Wiggly World, Blockhead, Swelling Itching Brain, Triumph of the Will. I mean, it's wild.
I'm surprised that Dave, My Baby Gave Me a Surprise wasn't, I mean, I know there's a video for it.
Yeah.
It's a pretty cool video. And that was also on the Men Who Make the Music. The first exposure I had to Devo was that song. And I'm surprised it wasn't like, I mean, it is a strange song. It's a strange video, but it has a great like pop sensibility. Like it could have been sort of a pop song in a way, but I don't think it was ever. I mean, I know it was a single off of this album, but I think it's an amazing song. I think a lot of the songs on this album are, like I said, they're not so overplayed and so oversaturated as some of the other Devo songs and albums that you know so well. So it's kind of like a nice. There are bands that like I do like the in between albums in a way because they're just still a bit fresher to me, over years and years and years of listening to certain bands.
Yeah, this record it doesn't have the distinction of being first or being, the record that has the pop hit, the pop hit, but the record is actually like incredible. It doesn't really have a hit. It doesn't really have a story. The story is that the band doesn't really like it themselves. So, but it's really good. I mean, it's
still it's a Devo record. I mean, I think I love all of their records, up until Shout. I think that's where it sort of, after Shout, I sort of drop off, a few songs here and there. But man, their first 5 records, if you think about, Are We Not Men, We Are Devo. This one, you got Freedom of Choice, you got New Traditionalists, and you got Oh No, It's Devo. I mean, between those 5 records, that's a solid batch of albums, I'd say.
Yeah. I really don't think there's a significant dip in quality anywhere in that first 5 records.
Yeah, and that's as good a run as you can have. You think about the first 4 Black Sabbath records. You think about 4 to 5 David Bowie records in a row. You think about Devo records in a run like this. That's all you can ask for. So I appreciate it. I like this album a lot. And I'm glad we were able to dip into Devo and to talk about them and what crazy people they must be. I mean, total just one of a kind people and band. And I hope I get to see them again, because I know they're at the very end of their sort of playing live, out there. I think they're kind of in their victory lap as a band. So hopefully they come somewhere. They're a band I've always just traveled to see too. So I'm fine with that. I just got to find the right time and place.
The only current upcoming dates they have are festivals. They have Beach Life Festival in Redondo and then Punk Rock Bowling.
My wife almost bought me tickets to the one in Redondo, and it was just like we couldn't make it work. But I'm hoping. I mean, I love seeing them in when they're like a headlining band for a show. But I agree. I don't think they're going to be. I think they're always from here on out. Whenever you see them, it's going to be part of a festival, which is kind of unfortunate because they're only going to play like a 45-minute set maybe. And as much as they play like they kind of play the same 20 songs, there's a few that get kind of thrown in. I think that's great. Like last time I saw them, they played Secret Agent Man from this album, and I love it. I mean, I love it's such a great cover, and it's sung by Bob One instead of Mark or Jer, and it's so fun, So stuff like that, I like. I still love what kind of even seeing Devo now is a real treat.
Well, we know you've got to go, but thank you so much for doing the show with us. Is there anything you want to plug? Anything you want us to follow up on? We have the Hal Shedad reissue, the first album.
out on Noise Reel Records. Definitely check that out. It's streaming everywhere so people can hear it. I'm in a band called Blood Circuits that plays really the Atlanta area, but we're releasing an album for streaming pretty soon. Well, 5 songs, but you know how it goes. It's like 25 minutes and 5 songs. And we'll see if we press any, we'll put it out there. But you can find Blood Circuits around. And I appreciate the time on the podcast. I enjoyed it a lot.
Awesome. Well, thank you for doing it. This is a really, really fun conversation with a wide range of topics we hit. So this is why we love
to edit, guests. Like I said, edit it down to a tight 30 minutes if you need to. I had a great time. I really appreciate the time.
We always let the long conversations go. I think those are fun episodes.
Cool.
I think that's what our listeners like too. I think our listeners like long ones a little more. So yeah.
Me too. Long form.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Have a good one.
To order Punk, call the number on your screen. Rush delivery is available. Remember, this special offer is not sold in stores.